The morning air outside the Franklin County Courthouse in Baton Rouge, Louisiana carried a quiet weight, like the city itself was holding its breath. It was just after 8 a.m., the kind of time where streets start to hum but stories haven't begun yet. Except today, one had already been written years ago, and it was coming back with every step Dr. Naomi Ellison took toward those old marble steps. She wasn't flashy. No news crew followed her, no entourage surrounded her. Just a woman in her early 60s, hair pulled back into a silver-streaked bun, dressed in a charcoal gray suit and modest heels. Her hands clutched a well-worn leather folder, scuffed edges, cracked spine, the kind of item that whispered of memories and unspoken truths. It was the same folder she had carried when she first walked these halls over 3 decades ago. Back then, she was a junior policy analyst trying to make sense of a broken system. Today, she was something else entirely. To most people she passed, the sleepy clerk tapping through TikTok behind the front desk, the flustered assistant fumbling with coffee, the uniformed guard glancing lazily at her visitor badge, she was nobody. Another suit with another clipboard. That was fine. Naomi preferred it that way. She didn't come to make noise, but if noise came looking for her, she was ready. She moved with calm precision, her steps echoing quietly down the long hallway lined with portraits of retired judges and outdated procedural signage. Each stride was deliberate, like she was walking back through time, reclaiming each tile beneath her heel. The elevator dinged softly as she reached the 3rd floor. She didn't hesitate. The doors slid open to reveal a familiar corridor. Worn carpet, flickering overhead lights, the faint scent of stale coffee and disinfectant. Naomi inhaled once, deeply, and stepped forward into her past. She passed courtroom 2C without looking inside. The doors were closed, but she remembered exactly how they creaked when opened, how the lock clicked with a thud that made your stomach drop. She had stood outside that room once, 29 years ago, clutching the same folder, waiting for a meeting that never happened. A file had gone missing, a complaint had disappeared, and so, eventually, did she. But now she was back, not as a forgotten analyst, not as a footnote, but as the newly appointed regional ethics supervisor from the Department of Justice, sent not just to audit procedures, but to observe everything: staff behavior, accountability systems, and most importantly, the culture that had festered inside this building for too long. At the security desk in the administrative wing, a young woman blinked in confusion when Naomi presented her credentials. "I'm here to begin a surprise evaluation of courthouse personnel conduct," Naomi said smoothly, her voice low and firm. "You'll find a memo from Director Holloway dated last week." The woman typed hurriedly, scanning the screen, her posture subtly shifting when Naomi's file popped up. "Oh, I didn't realize someone from D.C. would be arriving today." "Good," Naomi smiled gently. "That's exactly how I planned it." With a clipped badge and a printed pass, she continued her walk down the hall, past frosted glass doors, past whispering clerks, past the same storage closet where she'd once hidden to cry after a superior dismissed her report as overly sensitive. Her hand brushed the leather folder absent-mindedly. Not today. Inside the observation room for courthouse security, a wall of monitors displayed black and white feeds from entrances, holding rooms, hallways. A sheriff's deputy in his late 50s sat with his boots propped up, thumbing through a sports magazine, chewing loudly on a toothpick. "You're not supposed to be in here without an escort," he grunted without looking up. Naomi didn't flinch. "I've been cleared by the DOJ. Your captain received the memo yesterday. I'm Naomi Ellison." The man glanced over, narrowed his eyes at her badge, then shrugged with a half-smirk. Not used to feds walking in like they own the place. "I don't need to own it," she replied, already walking past him toward the monitors. "Just making sure it still works the way it's supposed to." She pulled a notepad from her bag and started scribbling notes with clean, calculated strokes. The man muttered something under his breath, something about clipboard cops and big egos. Naomi didn't respond. She didn't need to, because today wasn't about trading words. It was about truth. and she wasn't leaving without it. What no one in that room knew, not the lazy deputy, not the distracted receptionist, not the indifferent clerk, was that Naomi had once been swallowed whole by this very place. Years ago, she'd walked these halls with hope in her step and a belief in the process. But that belief was shattered in a single moment by a man whose name still sat in her file, sealed in a drawer that had long since collected dust. But Naomi had never forgotten, and now neither would this courthouse. As she turned to leave the observation room, a rumble of distant thunder echoed outside, shaking the old windows ever so slightly. It wasn't the sky that was about to storm. It was her, quiet, measured, relentless, because Dr. Naomi Ellison hadn't come back for nostalgia. She'd come for the reckoning. Absolutely. Here's part 2 of the story, written in American narrative style with immersive detail, continuity in names and setting, and designed to hook the viewer through emotion and suspense. Deputy Travis Munn had spent the last 25 years patrolling the halls of Franklin County Courthouse like he owned every inch of it. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but his presence always felt like a closed door, something you had to knock on, something you needed permission to pass through. He wore his authority like his badge, too tight, too polished, and a little too proud. So when he spotted the unfamiliar woman in the navy suit moving through the west hallway, his jaw instinctively clenched. She hadn't asked for directions. She hadn't nodded at the guards. She hadn't looked his way even once, and that more than anything irritated him. There was something about the way she walked, measured, intentional, like she belonged here more than he did. Munn had seen women like her before, or at least he thought he had, educated, polished, think-they-know-it-all types. Clipboard bureaucrats from D.C. who wouldn't last a week in real police work but somehow had the power to review it. He called them oversight bloodhounds, quiet, nosy, and always sniffing for trouble. But this one, she was different. She didn't flash her authority, she wore it like oxygen, calm, natural, necessary. And that scared him. By mid-morning, Munn was pacing the corridor near courtroom 3B, watching her movements through reflective windows. He kept tabs from a distance, first from the corner bench by the coffee machine, then from behind a half-closed door across the hall. She was inspecting things, taking notes, talking to no one. The silence aided him. Around 11:17 a.m., she stood near the side stairwell, reviewing a page in her leather folder. Munn walked up with a purpose, shoulders squared, voice cocked like a warning shot. "You lost, ma'am?" he asked, voice dipping just low enough to carry weight. She turned slowly, no surprise on her face, only that same unreadable calm. "No," Naomi said. "Are you?" It hit him like a punch to the gut. Munn's jaw twitched. He tried to recover. "This area isn't for public access." "I'm not the public," she replied, eyes locked onto his. "You know that. You're walking around without any visible clearance," he snapped. "Folks are starting to talk." "I'm sure they'll get answers," she said, calmly jotting something into her notebook. Her tone wasn't smug. It was surgical, precise, like she'd already filed the report and was just here for final signatures. That infuriated him. "You got an attitude problem," he muttered. Naomi looked up again, this time slower, more deliberate. "And you have a perception problem." That did it. He stepped forward, blocking the narrow hallway, chest puffed, voice sharp. "You think just because you've got some DOJ patch on your lapel and a fancy title, you can walk in here and start throwing weight around?" "I don't think that," she said, voice low. "I know it." They stared at each other, two still frames in a slow-burning fire. His fists were clenched, hers were steady. Then she added softly, "I've read your file, Officer Munn." Silence. "I know about the written warnings. I know what was sealed, and I know who signed off on it." His breath caught. Naomi leaned just a fraction closer, not enough to invade his space, just enough to let the words land exactly where they needed to. "Careful," she said. "This building has more cameras than it used to." Munn didn't move. Couldn't. His pulse thundered in his ears, his face flushing under the weight of her words. She walked past him without another glance, her heels echoing behind her like punctuation marks. He stood there, in the silence she left behind, realizing, maybe for the first time in his life, that he had been seen. Really seen. And he didn't like it. What Munn didn't realize, what his pride would never let him admit, was that he'd seen her before. But not like this. 30 years ago, he was just a patrol deputy fresh off academy, full of fire and full of himself. And Naomi? She was a young compliance auditor fresh out of Howard University with ideals sharper than any badge. He wouldn't remember her. Not her face. Not the questions she asked about missing surveillance footage. Not the way he leaned into her space and brushed off her inquiry with a crude joke about pretty girls playing with paperwork. He wouldn't remember blocking her path or brushing her arm just a little too hard. But she remembered everything. She remembered the scent of his aftershave, the rasp in his voice, the way his nameplate gleamed beneath the flickering hallway light. And while he forgot her like a receipt in his glove box, she had spent every year since then building a path back to this moment, not out of revenge, but out of purpose. Naomi Ellison had not come back to make him remember. She had come to make him irrelevant. That afternoon, she sat in a glass-walled conference room on the top floor, reviewing personnel shift logs and archived disciplinary files. She cross-referenced timestamps, noted gaps, saw patterns no one else had bothered to look for. Travis Munn's name appeared more than once. So did others. It was a culture, a structure, and it had gone unchecked for far too long. As the sun lowered behind the courthouse skyline, casting golden shadows across polished stone, Naomi paused. She looked out the window, not for reflection, but for resolve. Because the storm she brought wasn't just about Travis Munn. It wasn't about any one man. It was about the silence that protected them. And she was here to break it. The courtroom was colder than Naomi remembered. Not because the air conditioning was too high, but because the silence inside felt different, dense, watchful. It wasn't the kind of silence that calms a room. It was the kind that warned you something was about to shift. She stepped through the staff side entryway, her leather folder in hand, her gaze calm and unreadable. The plan was simple: sit in the back, review protocols, observe behaviors. Nothing more. That was the job. But jobs rarely go as planned in rooms where history lingers like a shadow. She barely made it 10 steps inside before the stillness snapped. "Hey, who the hell let you in here?" The voice cracked across the room like a lightning bolt, loud, defensive, threatened. Heads turned. The clerk froze mid-note. A juror glanced over his shoulder. Even the judge stopped mid-sentence, eyebrow. Naomi stood still, her eyes locked on the source, without surprise. There he was. Deputy Travis Munn, arms crossed, standing near the jury box with a scowl so sharp it could have cut concrete. His tone oozed arrogance. His posture screamed ownership. "I said this area's for authorized personnel only." Naomi raised her folder slightly, voice calm. "I am authorized." He stepped toward her, slow and theatrical, like a man used to being the center of every room he walked into. "You don't flash a badge, you don't check in, you just stroll in like you run the place?" "I'm here to observe," she replied evenly. "The authorization memo is on file." "Well, I don't see a badge, and I sure as hell don't see anyone around here who knows who you are." Before she could respond, his hand lashed out. The folder flew from her grip, papers scattering across the polished tile like autumn leaves caught in a gust of wind. Reports, memos, signed clearances, All of it. Weeks of preparation. Now a mess on the floor. The room gasped, a sharp collective intake of breath, the kind that says, "Did he just?" But he wasn't done. With one swift motion, he kicked her tote bag aside, sending it skidding under a bench. Then, without warning, he shoved her, 2 hands to the chest, hard. Naomi stumbled back, her heel caught on the smooth edge of the floor. She went down. A dull thud echoed as her back hit the ground. Her breath escaped her in a short, stunned gasp. And still, no one moved. Not the clerk, not the judge, not the gallery. It wasn't just what Munn did, it was how easily he did it. How sure he was that no one would stop him, that the room would do what it had always done when power pushed too hard. Nothing. "You people always think you can do whatever the hell you want," he muttered, standing over her. "Always pushing, always thinking you're above it all." Naomi looked up, her face unreadable. Not fear, not pain, just silence, the kind that sees everything. "Get up," Munn barked. "Get your ass out of here before I drag you out in cuffs." He turned to the room, gesturing wildly. "This area is restricted. No one comes back here unless they're cleared. And she ain't." Still, no one stepped in. Naomi slowly pushed herself up. She didn't speak. Her hands trembled only slightly as she began gathering her scattered papers one by one. No rush, no panic, just deliberate recovery. The judge finally cleared his throat. "Officer Munn," he began, voice uncertain, cracking under pressure. But before he could finish, "Is she here yet?" The words rang out from the back of the courtroom like a second explosion. A man in a charcoal suit stepped through the doors, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. His voice was steady, confident. Everyone turned to look. The man's eyes scanned the room until they landed on her. Then he smiled. "Dr. Ellison," he said, loudly enough for all to hear, "the Attorney General is on the line. She'd like to speak with you before the formal review begins. Also, congratulations, your interim appointment has just been confirmed." Gasps. Real ones this time. Audible shock. The judge leaned forward in his seat, visibly stunned. The stenographer dropped her pen. A low murmur swept through the gallery. Munn stepped back. A full step. Naomi stood tall now. She adjusted her jacket, picked up her bag, and walked past him, not with vengeance, not with pride, but with the quiet authority of someone who didn't need the room's permission to exist in it. She didn't look at him. She didn't have to. Every eye in that courtroom was on her, not him. And that silence? It wasn't protection anymore. It was fear of her title, of her power, of what came next. Naomi paused at the door. She turned just enough not to face Munn, but to address the judge, who still sat frozen. "This isn't about who belongs in this room," she said, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "It's about who's been allowed to stay here too long." Then she walked out. And just like that, the air shifted. The silence got heavier. Not with complicity this time. With consequence. Because for the first time in 30 years, Naomi wasn't the one being thrown out of the room. She was the one clearing it. The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent. Eerily so. Naomi Ellison stood still, her folder tucked beneath her arm, flanked by 1 U.S. Marshal and a swirling storm of emotion just beneath her ribcage. But none of it showed on her face. Not the pain in her back, not the humiliation she'd swallowed in front of a room full of silence, not the satisfaction of watching the tide finally turn. She didn't need to perform. Her presence alone did the work. When the elevator doors opened onto the 4th floor, she stepped out like nothing had happened. A soft carpet replaced the cold tile, and the walls bore framed headlines about judicial transparency and equal accountability. Naomi didn't bother looking at them. She'd learned long ago that most institutions were better at framing ethics than following them. Inside a modest but modern conference room, a large monitor lit up with a secure video call. On screen, the U.S. Attorney General offered a warm but firm smile. "Dr. Ellison," the the voice greeted. "We just saw the footage. Are you all right?" Naomi nodded once. "I'm fine, thank you." The AG's face darkened just slightly. "What happened down there never should have happened, but if there was ever doubt as to why you were assigned here, it's gone now." Naomi didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth had made itself loud. "We've confirmed your interim appointment," the AG continued. "Effective immediately, you hold full oversight authority for all internal investigations in this district. Local admin answers to you now. We'll be issuing a formal press statement by end of day." "I understand," Naomi said, her voice smooth as stone in a river. "Send me the sealed misconduct archives. I want full access." "Already done." The screen faded to black, and the marshal handed Naomi a slim black case. Inside it was all there, 30 years of ignored complaints, misfiled reports, suspiciously vanished documents. Names she hadn't heard in decades popped up like ghosts in an abandoned town. But one name appeared more than the others. Travis Munn. She didn't even flinch when she saw it. Just flipped the pages, highlighter ready, pen steady. Excessive force. Verbal threats. Misconduct during jury selection. Physical intimidation. Retaliation. Anonymous reports. Lost footage. All conveniently labeled unsubstantiated. She closed the case file and exhaled slowly. "Give me a day," she said. "I'll be ready." By the time she returned to her temporary office, the courthouse halls were buzzing, but not with voices, with movement. People cleared space when she passed. Doors didn't close on her anymore. Some looked her way with quiet awe. Others looked away, afraid of what she represented. Naomi wasn't just an official now. She was a reckoning in a gray suit. Marcus, her young analyst from Atlanta, was already waiting with more files. 3 new complaints just came in, 2 from former staff, 1 from an anonymous tip, all about Munn. Naomi didn't blink. She took the stack, scanned the contents, then handed him back the top one. "Start with this. Match timestamps. Cross-reference security footage if any exists." Marcus nodded, already pulling up his laptop. "Want me to schedule interviews?" "Not yet," she said. "People are still watching. Let them. Because that's what this moment needed. Not just accountability, but visibility. She'd been buried in silence for 30 years. That silence was no longer acceptable, not from her, not from anyone. The reports kept coming. An ex-clerk described being cornered in the basement after filing an inquiry about lost evidence. A janitor reported being forcibly removed from a break room without cause during a supposed sweep. A court intern, just 19, claimed Munn had grabbed his collar and whispered, "Nobody will believe you." Naomi's face didn't change. But inside she was no longer angry. She was focused. Later that afternoon, Marcus poked his head in again. "There's someone here, says she used to work here, former clerk, name's Lorraine Matthews." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Send her in." Lorraine entered slowly, eyes darting around as if expecting Munn himself to step from the shadows. She was in her early 40s, sharp eyes behind nervous glances. "Sorry to come unannounced," she said, voice low. I heard what happened. Saw the clip online." Naomi motioned for her to sit. "You were here in 2015, correct?" Lorraine nodded. "They moved me to records after I reported Munn for harassment. HR said it would be less contact that way, but nothing ever came of it." "And you haven't spoken since?" "I couldn't. I had 2 kids, mortgage. He'd just show up. Outside court, near my house, watching, waiting." Naomi didn't blink. She opened a drawer, pulled out a printed statement form. "Would you be willing to make it official now?" Lorraine stared at the paper for a moment, then picked up the pen. "Yeah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I would." As she wrote, Naomi sat quietly across from her, watching history correct itself on a single page. Not loudly, not with sirens or shouting. just ink. That evening, as the courthouse emptied and dusk settled over Baton Rouge, Naomi stayed behind. Her office glowed softly in the fading light, her desk cluttered with notes, statements, and flagged files. But it wasn't chaos, it was construction. She was building something, not just a case, a foundation. And this time it would hold. Tomorrow would bring more stories, more faces, more truth. But tonight Naomi Ellison had turned the silence into evidence. And for the first time in 30 years, the building was listening. By the next morning, the air in Baton Rouge's courthouse felt different. Not quieter, not louder, just heavier, like the building itself understood what was coming. Naomi Ellison arrived early as usual. Her heels echoed down the marble halls with the same deliberate cadence that had begun to unsettle those who once walked these corridors with unchecked power. She wasn't here to make people feel afraid, but she was absolutely here to make sure they didn't feel untouchable anymore. At her desk, Marcus was already waiting, bleary-eyed but buzzing with energy. 4 more reports, he said, sliding a stack of folders across the table. 1 signed, 3 anonymous, all connected to Munn. Naomi didn't flinch. She opened the top file and started reading. By 10:30 a.m., the internal oversight panel was gathered in the courthouse's formal hearing room. 7 members sat around an oval table, 2 from the state's DOJ, 3 civilian advocates, and 2 judges from neighboring parishes. The media had been barred from this session for confidentiality. But that didn't stop people from talking. Naomi stood at the front of the room, facing the panel with calm eyes and a folder in hand. It wasn't thick, just a slim packet of truth. She began without a slideshow, no charts, no dramatics. "This is not a case against one officer," she said, voice clear. "This is an examination of culture." She laid out what they'd found. 19 complaints spanning 27 years, all connected to Deputy Travis Munn. 6 had been dismissed, 8 had been resolved internally. 5 had mysteriously disappeared. She showed discrepancies in logbooks, access badge scans that didn't align with written reports. She mapped out every redacted line, every missing form, every inconclusive stamp, and turned them into a timeline of neglect. And then, quietly, she pulled out a different file. "My first complaint," she said, "filed in 1993. She placed it on the table. A faded report, scanned and reprinted, the ink still legible, the trauma still fresh. I was 25, new, idealistic. I asked the wrong question. I was cornered in a basement hallway, intimidated, and when I filed my report, it disappeared." The panel listened in stunned silence. She unfolded a black and white photo, grainy, time-stamped. A younger Naomi, her back to the wall, a man's hand on her shoulder, too firm, too close, his badge half visible. "I was told the camera in that hallway was broken," she said. "Clearly it wasn't." Nobody spoke. Then, from the back of the room, a voice broke the stillness. "I'd like to be heard." It was Lorraine Matthews. The panel allowed it. She stepped forward, voice shaking but resolute. "He grabbed me too, in 2015, after I filed a report about lost chain of custody files. I was moved to the parking citation department. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would protect me." Naomi stood quietly, letting Lorraine speak her truth, out loud, in the same courthouse where she'd once been silenced. After the testimonies, the room paused, not out of protocol, but out of gravity. No one wanted to speak first, because doing so would mean accepting that they'd all been part of this, one way or another. Finally, a civilian panelist leaned forward. "What are you recommending, Dr. Ellison?" Naomi didn't hesitate. "Permanent termination of Deputy Munn," she said. "Loss of pension, full decertification, and mandatory public acknowledgement of failure, not just for him, but for the system that allowed him to thrive." A second panelist asked, "Do you believe this will stop future abuse?" Naomi's gaze didn't falter. No, but it makes it harder to bury. She paused. And that's where change starts. That afternoon, the panel reconvened and returned their decision. It wasn't just approval, it was unanimous. Within an hour, Naomi's recommendation became official. Travis Munn was stripped of badge, title, and benefits. But that wasn't the real victory. The real moment came when Naomi walked out of the building, down the courthouse steps, and saw people waiting. Not in protest, not in panic, but in quiet recognition. A few nodded. One woman whispered, "Thank you." A young man in a security uniform raised his fist, not high, not loud, just enough to say, "I see you." And Naomi nodded back. But it didn't stop there. Later that week, an anonymous envelope arrived at Naomi's office. Inside were more records, this time connected to someone else, a retired sergeant. Dozens of reports bearing his initials, covering Munn's tracks, notes written in the margins, cases that never saw daylight. It wasn't over. Not even close. Naomi submitted a formal request to the DOJ for expanded oversight and a national review of courthouse accountability procedures. Her new proposal included a public misconduct registry, whistleblower protections, civilian review boards in every jurisdiction, and a 5-year retroactive audit on all closed complaints involving physical misconduct. When asked how far she was willing to take it, Naomi simply replied, "As far as it has to go." By the end of the month, her name had been mentioned in 3 national hearings, 2 Senate committee proposals, and more than 100 internal memos across the country. But Naomi didn't care about headlines. She cared about the quiet moments that came after. The janitor who whispered, "You gave me courage." The intern who left a note that said, "Because of you, I won't let them make me small." The grandmother who mailed a photo of her granddaughter with the message, "Now I know she might be okay." In her final week before stepping down, Naomi walked past courtroom 3B one last time. She didn't stop. Didn't need to. The room didn't hold her anymore. She held it, and as she turned the corner, the weight she'd carried for 3 decades didn't disappear. It settled. Not as a burden, as proof that even when justice comes late, it can still come loud. Naomi Ellison didn't walk into the courthouse to make a statement. She walked in because someone had to. Someone had to face what others ignored. Someone had to carry the weight, not for attention, but for resolution. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She didn't even flinch when the system tried once again to push her to the side. She just stood. And somehow, that was louder than anything else in the room. Her story wasn't about one man or one act. It was about silence. The kind that wraps around institutions like fog, that settles into the cracks of everyday life until it becomes easier to ignore than to face. Naomi didn't just break that silence. She exposed it. She showed what happens when someone carries the truth long enough for it to stop feeling like a burden and start feeling like purpose. The lesson is simple but powerful. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it enters a room calm and quiet and refuses to be moved. Sometimes it takes 30 years for the world to listen, but when it finally does, it can't unhear what's been said. It can't unsee what's been shown. There are people watching this right now who have carried their own silences. People who were told it wasn't the right time to speak or that their stories were too small, too late, too inconvenient. But Naomi's story proves something different. It proves that your voice still matters, that your pain doesn't expire, and that accountability, even when delayed, can still be delivered. If this story spoke to you even just a little, leave a comment. Type 1 if you felt something watching it, type 0 if it didn't connect, so I can make the next one better. Your voice matters. Every voice does. Because in the end, it's not just stories that shape justice. It's the people willing to tell them, And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to look away.